Excited for this next panel, Empowering Collaboration Across Public and Private Sectors. Joining us, Nicole Eiffel, Jason Tisco, and Robert Magoo, and Ken Poole is going to be our moderator. So I will turn it over to them for a great session. Thank you all.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate it.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Ken Poole. I run a group called the Center for Regional Economic Competitiveness, and CREC has been around for 25 years, created basically to help use evidence to drive decision-making in connecting economic development, workforce development, and higher education in sort of like a space. Our focus has been on sort of program development, but we were sort of really driven by the notion that evidence needed to be an important part of the work that we do. And so I'm really excited to be here today because I'm actually among my people. It's interesting because the field that we started in, evidence was basically a story that someone was telling, or it was whatever was on someone's mind at the moment. It sounds familiar. So what we want to do is actually build, sort of reconstruct and think about how our world fits within this sort of uncertain world that Mark just talked about. So I want to introduce three folks who are going to help me with this conversation, and we're going to just talk amongst ourselves. And if you have questions, feel free to ask them. But I wanted to actually get these folks talking a little bit first. Jason Tisco, who is sitting next to me, is Senior Vice President for Policy and Programs at the U.S. Chamber, and I've known Jason for several years, and I know that a lot of his work is focused around driving innovation in the nation's education and workforce system through the use of better data and developing products and services, and I think he'll talk a little bit about some of those things that they're working on. Next to him is Nicole Eiffel. Nicole is Deputy Director for Data at the Gates Foundation, and I've known her for a few years. Her work is focused around improving data access to help low-income individuals actually improve their lot in life by accessing post-secondary education and better driving their limited resources to more effective outcomes through that access. And then last but certainly not least is Robert Magoo, who's the Chief Data Officer from Arkansas, the state of Arkansas, and he's focused around improving the Arkansas's capacity to share, analyze, and use the state's administrative data to solve meaningful problems. So I think I'm just wanted to set that up because none of us, well, not none of us. I think Robert would demonstrate that he is a data geek in the purest sense, wouldn't you? But the rest of us are data geeks in the sense that we know that data is a really critical part of the work that we do and where we want to try to see the work that we're doing go, and it's become part of our mission. So I wanted to actually start with each of you and have you just maybe spend just a little bit of time telling us a little bit more about your career than I just poorly did, and how you've gotten to sort of this space and why this particular moment in terms of the work that you're doing around supporting data is a really critical moment. So I'm going to start with you, Jason, since you're right here next to me.
Yes, thank you, Ken. Hello, everyone. Jason Tisco with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and its foundation. I actually work for both organizations. For those who might not be familiar with us, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, headquartered in D.C., is the world's largest business federation. We represent over 1,500 state and local chambers of commerce, have a collective reach of over 3 million firms, and part of our role is to make sure that the business voice is represented on the Hill. So I support education workforce policy on the membership side. The vast majority of my time is really on the foundation side of our house, which is our nonprofit affiliate. So it is not membership-based, it's philanthropically driven, and we're all about leveraging business leadership to advance public good. So we do a variety of different things, but the like disaster recovery and resilience, the Hiring Our Heroes program, some of you might be familiar with, is run out of there. We do a lot of work around civics education, but the stuff I do is all in the education and workforce space. So I like to think of the foundation as more field-facing. So that's where we're actually going out and mobilizing employer leadership around a wide variety of issues around employer engagement, data and technology infrastructure, and finance. So kind of as part of my journey with the Chamber Foundation, engaging the business community, we started with building talent supply chains, and CREC has been a great partner in that work ever since the early days of it. So I've been going strong for over 10 years now. But as we've been trying to stand up these authentically led workforce development systems that are authentically led by employers, we noticed all these gaps in the data. And we noticed that there were gaps around information about jobs, information about learners and workers and the experiences they've had, and about employment. So we embarked on a series of initiatives that were really designed to improve data about those three things. So we have new tools coming online that are really focusing on sending a better signal from employers about what jobs are in demand and what are the skills associated with those jobs. We have, through our T3 Innovation Network, a whole variety of initiatives focused on many things, but mainly empowering learners and workers with data, mainly data about their employment experiences, their education experiences, their community experiences, military experiences, but how are they getting better data about themselves to take action in the labor market. And then probably what's most relevant is our work around JEDEX, the Jobs and Employment Data Exchange, which is really trying to advance data and technology standards for job and employment records held by employers themselves, and really trying to transform in a fundamental way how they share that information out to a number of different stakeholders, but namely state and federal agencies. So data is very much important to both the Chamber and the Chamber Foundation, and we've really been trying to experiment on the foundation side with the support of Gates Foundation, Walmart, Stride Education Foundation, and others on how we could really transform the employer role in the production and sharing of that data.
Great. Back to call.
Hi, all. Is this? Yeah. Okay. Nicole Eiffel, Deputy Director for Data US at the Gates Foundation. Most of you are probably familiar with Gates. We are really focused on ensuring that everyone deserves to lead a healthy and productive life. We have several taglines, and I'm always starting with the wrong one, but just think of the NPR podcast, and you'll certainly have heard one of our sponsorships. Within that area of work, we're doing two things, essentially. We have global health and development as part of our investment strategy, as well as U.S. education and economic mobility. Within that latter area is where the data work resides. As a foundation, we're really committed to thinking about systems change that is essentially removing race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status as predictors of student success. We define success as attaining a credential of value and ensuring that learners and workers are moving through the education and workforce pipeline in ways that are successful for themselves. That is where we think about economic mobility. For all of that, as Ken was mentioning, and even Jason, data is an enabler. And I really appreciated Mark's comments earlier that the response rates for some of the data that we have coming out is pretty anemic right now. And as a foundation, we've really been able to elevate the importance of not just research, but using data for decision-making within institutions of higher ed, within state policy, within the way that we think about connecting education and workforce systems that are traditionally siloed. And that's a reason that I'm here really representing the great work that we've done to invest in this space, not just through Coleridge or JEDEX, as Jason mentioned, but also the Value Data Collaborative, our Education and Workforce Indicators Framework, which is really about focusing a research agenda around a set of critical questions and really understanding the most parsimonious set of data that you could use from existing systems to really report on that information as a state agency. So I'll pass it to Robert.
All right. Good morning. As Kit said, I'm Robert Magoo. I'm the Chief Data Officer for the state of Arkansas. I've been a public servant of the state of Arkansas for 24 years, and the whole time it's been in data management, data analytics, essentially putting together data to support policy and practice. I started 24 years ago on a statewide data warehouse project where I was pretty much at the very end of the data pipeline, the data supply chain, basically just having to stitch together whatever I happened to get, no matter how it was collected or dealing with surveys or whatever. And I spent the past 2.5 decades kind of like working my way up the supply chain to get right at the beginning where data is collected to try to improve the quality at the source, but largely borrowing from Six Sigma and manufacturing quality, things like that, those types of things. So we're not just kind of at the tail end and very kind of inspection and correction. And now we're really working to kind of activate that value for individual residents, individual employers, individual communities. And a big part of that is the new data collection mechanisms we get from the Jobs and Employment Data Exchange, Talent Pipeline Management, National Labor Exchange, to remove some of that uncertainty that Ken was talking about this morning, like by getting local, timely, actionable data. But with all the sources, we have to put it all together because people don't come to us in pieces. They come to us as whole people. And so we have to put all the funding, the data, everything together to build a data ecosystem, and then to activate the value. If we go to the next slide, a couple of things we'll talk about a little bit today, how we're activating the value. One is more for state staff. So this came out of a lot of successive college initiatives, and I think almost everyone in the room had some kind of role in this. Dr. Jake Walker will talk about this later today. An integrated referral and outcome system to help people today using integrated data to drive actionable co-enrollment and integrated service delivery practices. And if we go to the next one, and then our Chief Workforce Officer, Mike Rogers, will talk about Arkansas Launch, which is really kind of an individualized view using AI on top of our statewide integrated data system to provide personalized guidance, recommendations, and support to every resident and every employer and every education training provider and student.
Terrific. Thanks, Robert. So very quickly, I wanted to actually take up, since Nicole, you brought it up during your comments, and it was something in the back of my mind, the comments that Mark made just a few minutes ago about this survey response rate and the notion that surveys are becoming increasingly challenging as a way to get data, and yet the kinds of data we're looking for, often that's the way we're getting it, right? And so this notion of moving towards sort of using all kinds of other ways of getting data and trying to triage the data systems is an important piece of the way we're approaching it. But I would love to hear from your perspective what you see are some of the big challenges. We know that the survey response rate is one of those, but what are some of the other ones? And Jason, you were just talking about one. I want to pick on you a little bit about the issue of trust as being one of the big challenges we're grappling with.
Yeah, so with respect to the surveys, that's something we've been tracking at the Chamber, and we recently participated in an interview with GAO around employer participation in a couple of those surveys. And the kind of big takeaway from what we were recommending is, we could try to validate the existing methodologies that are used to source and analyze the data and how it's reported, and we could try to make some incremental progress. But if we see the trend line and where it's going, it invites us to really think about what are some alternative means by which we could collect this information and to actually make it more trustworthy. So, JEDEX is an example of that, where how can we move from survey data to administrative data to answer some of these questions, and how can we get it in a more secure, timely way from the employers themselves through APIs and other means of data sharing. So I think there's creative ways we can solve some of these problems that not only get us better data at a lower cost, but can also then be more timely and complete data, more comparable data. So I'm really an optimist about how we can do some things differently, but I think it's really imperative for us to do it, not just because of the issues around, the funding cuts and things like that, but to this point about trust is there's a lot of distrust out there. And I can argue that a lot of that distrust has been earned in many respects. And when it comes to data, it could be used for good or ill. And it's data in the wrong hands could be a bad thing. And I think the more we could kind of say, how are we creating better data collection and reporting systems that are improving trust, that's going to be an important lens at which we need to look at this. Because if you look at some of the numbers that come out, unless you're really deep in the weeds in how and understanding where this data comes from, why there's variance in the data, when it's going to be trued up, and why that variance could be significant, people are going to take it at face value. And a lot of people aren't going to take the time to dig into that methodology and understand it well. So as data is becoming used more, reported more, disseminated in a larger scale, we need to be really careful about managing people's expectations around the data and how they should be interpreting it. But I think it's a good thing. It's a good challenge to have. And I think it invites us to be really creative to overcome some of these barriers, whether it's barriers around cost, infrastructure, sourcing of data, administrative data versus statistical survey data. We think there's a bright future ahead, but we have a lot of work to do.
Well, and it's funny you should bring that up, because I remember having some conversations many years ago about the American Community Survey when it was initially introduced, and we had these sort of things called margins of error, and people were looking at it going, I don't know what this is. And yet increasingly we have to pay attention to things like that, which the normal person on the street doesn't really understand. And all they know is that the numbers are all over the place, and why would you trust it? And,
Yeah,
and,
like the-
and it's a challenge because of the fact that we're trying to get it out quicker, and quicker doesn't always necessarily mean better. And so we have to grapple with some of those issues.
Yeah, and just looking at the, when we pulled up the variance rates and some of the employment numbers being reported, I mean, they're so significant that it could either be a significant increase in jobs happened or actually jobs were lost. So which is it?
Yeah. So Nicole, the work you've been focused on, I think, has been a lot about access, the big piece of the work can you maybe speak a little bit to?
Yeah, well, I would say we're trying to move past access and make sure that the data is usable. So
Right.
to your original question about what barriers do we see
Yeah.
within the community, and some of the reflections that I've had over the last few weeks as we see some of these critical data sets, whether surveys or otherwise, threatened by funding reductions, I worry that we haven't made some of this critical information accessible and understandable to the end users. And when I say end users, for us at Gates, we're really thinking about students, parents, teachers, and other practitioners, whether it's district leaders, state agencies. And while we're doing, I think, a pretty good job with the folks in this room of building awareness around the types of platforms and data systems available, we're not doing nearly as well, I would say, in translating the types of insights that we see in day-to-day media into something that's accessible for a lay audience in terms of understanding when you say, that the average debt that a student graduates from college is a certain amount, folks aren't connecting that to these federal data collections. And I think that's a lot of the problem. We've got kitchen table conversations about challenges in education, challenges about the skills that you find in the workforce, but unless you're in specific conversations, you can't map that back to the critical sources. And so I'm very much worried in this moment about what happens 6-9 months from now when we start to see some gaps in the way that the media and others can describe the challenges that students and teachers are having. I'd say the other challenge, so that's one around just kind of awareness of the sources of information, whether or not their surveys are administrative, but just understanding that the value isn't just that the number's out there, it's about the fact that it needed to be collected, and there's a whole mechanism underneath it that takes time. But the other thing that I see as a barrier is often we actually sometimes have too much data, right? Like teachers are often receiving new tools, new dashboards, new ways of engaging with students. And the problems are often coming to how much time do you have day to day to learn that new tool? I use teachers as an example because K-12 is one of our largest areas of investment within our education work at Gates. But I think we see that across our state agencies, across the departments that we work on. And that's where I find Coleridge and other collaboratives and networks to be really effective ways to share that information and knowledge, because we don't all have, an extra 3 or 4 hours to be as deep as Robert in all of the data. And that's probably an undercount for the time that he spends, right? And so, not only do we see these barriers around the sources and the time it takes to get up to speed on them, but I would say one of the solution spaces that we are continuing to think about is what sort of doors are opened by generative AI, right? There's a lot there that connects with trust, as Jason said, but there are numerous opportunities to save significant time in understanding and processing data and information in ways that I just think are just not available to practitioners. I was going to say a general audience, but we actually know students are using Gen AI products way more than most folks. And in fact, Black and Latinx students, according to a Pew survey, are using them more than white students. So often when we're thinking about the types of reasons we collect data to advise students on their careers, to advise them on where they can go with education, we're thinking about what are the tools that they're using and how are they getting that data. And it's not always from the sources that we all know about. So how do we make sure we're leaning into that for better information and that it's packaged in a way that's more accessible?
So Robert, talk to us a little bit from your perspective, some of the barriers and challenges you see. And I'm particularly interested in the data collection process and some of the barriers associated with that, because I think you probably have some unique insights because you've been in these agencies working on that part of the problem. So if you wouldn't mind just sort of diving into sort of where you see are some of the key challenges that we're facing.
And I think with agencies, I think we're at a statewide level, we're kind of about 8 years in now, so we're past most of the barriers with administrative data, with cross interdepartmental, and we're really focused more on cross sector now. But I know a lot of it was a perception that, well, we're not allowed to share this data because of X, and our federally cognizant agency doesn't want us to do this, to the point we had to bring in the federally cognizant agencies to talk with them and say, no, this is okay, we want to do this. And I know the Labor Department of Education have been really good about releasing joint guidance saying, this is, there's ways to do it safely, this is the benefit, this is how to do it, and more of that would be beneficial. And then kind of more of our barriers now that we've got an ecosystem and we're not treating things from a program-centric perspective. Like Nicole said, we're trying to, from a person-centric perspective of user-centered design, and how do we, instead of giving 37 tools, give, simple, Mike's always a 6-click simple, like how do we cut through the noise and give someone what they need when they need it with everything we know. We're kind of pulling together across a lot of funding streams. That's kind of the biggest barrier, or at least a non-value-added activity right now, because we have to do a lot of blending and braiding of funding, and that's why we worked with Cacti Stack on the field guide for ingrained data systems, and that's been very helpful. But I think that's an area where we can kind of like move forward, because we have some uncertainty around funding sources. We need to diversify our funding sources. We need to maximize what we have, and especially if we lower authorization or things like that, get more demonstration authority. Like we need to have clear guidance and tools for how to leverage our funding effectively. So I think that it'll pretty much take care of itself, because we pay for the multiple versions of the same data and activity systems. So we just need to be smarter about how we leverage this resource.
And if I could just build on, because as Nicole and Robert were talking, I created about another half dozen list of barriers. For the sake of brevity, the one I'd really like to emphasize is cost and burden as a major barrier. So as part of like the JetX initiative, we have gone back and documented that there's over 150 potential reports an employer may be subject to when they're getting solicitations around data about jobs and employment. And in UI alone, you have 53 different systems that do not share any standardized data model across them. So for companies that have multiple establishments, they have to customize reports. So we're seemingly asking for the same information, but it's defined very differently by the authoritative source documents. And all of that adds up. And each incremental cost builds, and there's a reason why the business community kind of has a reflexive attitude of like, no more. Let's lobby against it. And it's what makes enhancing UI wage records so difficult. But even that, think about how we're trying to bootstrap the UI system to give us more data to address other questions that really don't have anything to do with the UI system.
Right.
And from a UI director's point of view, or from the business community's point of view, they say, why are we adding this here? It's not necessary. It's outside of the mission. And I think those are some things we need to contend with. So it's not that these need to be permanent barriers, but we need to think creatively around them. And that's kind of part of the value proposition of an effort like JetX, where we're saying, hey, we could do this in a more public-private way, instead of just trying to kind of have these little pitch battles about every data collection. What if we were to actually move towards more of a standardized data model and shared APIs that will allow us to share this data in a more modern way? And it's going to be more complete, more timely, more comparable, and less costly and less burdensome, not just for the business community who needs to share some of that data, but for government itself, who's collecting and analyzing the data. So whenever there's a data collection, a report is issued saying this is what we anticipate the burden to be on employers as well as government. So both sides are incurring the cost and burden of this, but we think there's just a more sane way of doing it if we work together. So it's not necessarily federal or state, it's public-private. It's kind of like the third way. And that's how we're trying to lean into this, to say we could do this much more efficiently if we engage in collective action. But you can imagine getting, even in the UI context, 53 different systems working together. That's a big challenge.
So as we think about this, it struck me as we bounced from the challenges of the system in managing data for the folks who are providing the data, the individual companies and individuals who are contributing to the data systems, and then also on the user side, whether it's individuals, parents, teachers, as you mentioned, Nicole, but also businesses and nonprofits who are supporting businesses and parents and teachers, and sort of the ecosystem we work with, which is that sort of intermediary network. And all of us have sort of different sets of challenges, and to try to think that we can solve them all in one conversation is probably a bit hubris. But it occurs to me as we think about this, we need to be making sure that all of those stakeholders are engaged in the right places. One of the challenges we run into in the work that we're doing with the nonprofit and private and the public sector folks who are doing intermediation, supporting workforce or economic development, or even in the higher ed field, is that it's the too much information problem is a really critical piece, and then it's how do you get access, and how do I get the questions I want answered instead of the questions you think I have, and so we run into those sort of dilemma all along the way, and the more I think the theme of the collaboration is a really important theme to sort of pull out from this conversation. But I am curious in terms of how you see and Jason, since you brought it up, I want to focus just a little bit on the data provider folks, the individual companies that are contributing information, or the individuals who are contributing into the we pick on the UI system because it's kind of like it is an obvious one for us to all capture in, but there's a lot of other administrative data tools that we can tap into. The UI system's going through some particularly unique challenges because it's going through this modernization effort at the same time that we're demanding more from it without the resources. So how does this effort that we're working on help that group solve their problem and get us to a point where we're better able to get the data out of it we want to? And I know the JetX initiative is some work that you're doing related to that. But Robert, I think you're also working on some of those problems in Arkansas as well. If you want to sort of speak to that to some degree, that would be great, to either of you.
And we're involved in the JetX initiative. We're in one of the pilot states, and I've been involved for the past 3 years from the beginning of that because I really believe in, I don't want to build a bigger Arkansas-specific silo. I want national interoperability, and so I think if 50 states do their own kind of enhanced LMI thing, it's just going to exacerbate the problem. So that the JetX approach are really kind of pulling together from the end user perspective, like what are all the different information needs? Let's get in a common language, working with the employers to speak the same language of businesses. That's been a value proposition. As we've talked to some of our largest employers, I see that value proposition, which is, I think, key. We're not just giving them another thing to do. They see value in it, and we're kind of like building that data-driven communication with business, which is also helpful for demand and other types of things, and to streamline talent pipeline management.
I could just build on what Robert was saying. I think what I want to key in on is value proposition. And I think we need to take very seriously how to build a shared value proposition for what we're trying to do around the data work. Because if it's all about evidence-based policy making, that's a fairly narrow value proposition. It's an important one, but that's when the business community would look at it and go, well, what's in it for me? Right. Or what's in it for the learners and workers who this is supposed to be helping? Instead of it helping them indirectly, how can it help them more directly? And I think a great example of that is Launch in Arkansas. So we have Robert here, the Chief Data Officer. We've got Mike Rogers here, the Chief Workforce Officer. And these are state leaders that are able to see the forest from the trees. They're not contained with or restricted to a single silo. And I came from a state, before I joined the chamber, I worked in a governor's office in the Department of Commerce. And I know silos, because we had them. And man, if we had a Chief Workforce Officer, if we had a Chief Data Officer, it would have been a very different experience for me. But getting those kinds of leadership positions in place that can see a larger value proposition and a more use cases than apply to a single data collection or use, I think that's critically important. I think Launch is a testament to that, because now you're seeing this isn't just collecting data for evidence-based policymaking, but now it's creating an interface where employers and workers can come and access data to make good decisions for their opportunities and to get things done, like find that job or find that training pathway that's relevant to them. And not just Arkansas, though I'll give you the glory, but we have just across the river, we have a digital transformation event happening at the chamber headquarters where Mike and Robert spoke at yesterday. But we also heard from Alabama. They're doing really interesting things in Indiana. So I think there's leadership out there. And many of them are in this room. And I think the more we're starting to create a shared value proposition and try to figure out who is this data working for, it's not just policymakers, but it's people, it's businesses. I think you're going to get a lot more support and a lot more business buy-in, and I think we're seeing that already in Arkansas.
So, Nicole, I want to pick on you just a little bit because one of the things that I just want to share this story with you and get your reaction, maybe. The story is I was here actually
Does
in
this story include me? I'm a little concerned here. Where we're going.
It doesn't yet, but I'll bring you in.
Okay.
I was in this room 2 weeks ago, and I was with a group of policymakers and we were talking about data, and one of them said in front of the group, data isn't important, it's the story that's important. I'd like your reaction to that and how the story, how we are using the data in this environment to help tell a story or help to shape the stories, and maybe some of the work that you're doing on focused around that particular.
I mean, I think there's some nuance in that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so my degree's in statistics, so I do die a little bit hearing that because, like, you can't make a story without data.
I know,
also,
well.
Hearing it's from a policymaker.
I died a lot during that conversation.
Anyway, for anyone who saw me nodding, I just wanted to. I was nodding for understanding, not agreement. But I that goes back to some of my earlier comments where I feel like there's just this challenge where folks want to put data in a box of data nerds and have go off and have fun adventures in Storyland, right? Like, those are not separate things. Like, the stories that we tell or understand about our own lived experiences, about the work we do with one another, are reliant on information that we're receiving over the course of days and months and weeks. The thing is that a lot of folks are calling that data. They're calling it information. They're saying stories are distinct. They're the same thing, right? But what I think is a problem is that many of us, I certainly know from my fellow statistics grads when I was, younger, not the most social individuals. And so often that means that the types of stories that are told by those that are deep in the weeds are usually including 500 footnotes. Well, see, you need to make sure that you're rounding this number. And if you don't know about this group, you can't actually really generalize it. And that's all fair and good and well in a room like this. But what I acknowledge about your policymakers' response is that buries the value of the information that's being shared. What we want to take away from it. And so I was talking to my team yesterday about what's a data point that in your just general life really has stuck with you and why. And a few of the examples for me is that the fact that in a given year, less than half of individuals who are starting a college degree are seeking a bachelor's. The majority of first-time college students are going for a certificate or an associate's. And yet the stories that we hear in the media all the time are you think that everybody started in a bachelor's degree, and that's just completely wrong, right? But we rely on a subset of individuals with outsized power to tell specific types of stories, and that's what drives this disconnect between information underneath it and how that's packaged for individuals. So in terms of solving that, for me, it's about, and this comes back to the networks and the collaboration and the fact that, yes, let's talk about data providers, but in the absence of having the beneficiaries in the room to also discuss what am I going to benefit from in the tool like Launch, you're going to miss the moment, right? And so both Jason and Robert are talking about the fact that that partnership wasn't just employers as a data provider, it was also the learner and the worker who is seeking those new skills. And so to me, the stories also require that same level of engagement from both the folks that are collecting the information and those that are truly affected by the results of the information we're putting out there.
Yeah, I think part of the reason I put you on the spot like that, and forgive me for doing that, but it was really, I thought you did it as terrific, but it was also the sort of notion that for some people, and maybe not everybody in this room, but for some people, it's the story that matters more than a data point. And I think that was an important sort of takeaway from my perspective because, and that's why sometimes facts get lost in the story.
Because the data point has to be about the impact, right? When we focus data on observations, which we always have to start with, right? There has to be a baseline level of understanding. There's we were also talking yesterday about individuals who aren't in any of our systems, and how do we even articulate a problem or a support for those students when we are learners, when we don't know where they are. And Opportunity Youth is a perfect example, right? Like the number of folks that, as a colleague was saying, like a third of folks drop out of high school, a third of folks only have a high school degree, a third of folks have a bachelor's and beyond or whatnot. And we're not telling all of those stories because we don't have even enough information about some of them. And so I'm curious what Jason and Robert think, because, Jason, I totally agree. Value proposition is super critical to get data providers in particular at the table to do something different with the data than they want, right? But that value proposition is sometimes unrealized until you actually have the right individuals in the room. And so how do we even decide at some point that the information is valuable enough to collect and report on when we don't always have a robust set of stakeholders to really engage in the conversation? And I know we're not going to solve that today, but
And a key point about that, the right stakeholders in the room, is that sometimes those stakeholders are not data people, right?
Most of the time,
Yes.
or no, don't frame themselves as data people.
Or
I
they
think
need to
everyone's
feel,
a data person.
and this is, I think, Jason's favorite comment, or they need to feel like they're getting something out of that conversation pretty soon. Robert, you were...
Well, maybe ideally not data people, or we can do the translation. And I'm a reformed footnote, kind of like, like I had to learn, especially when we started dealing with the different business stakeholders, to kind of like, I call it the magic box concept. Just like, well, I'll just tell you what it does or ask you what it needs. It's like, I'm not going to tell you how it works inside unless you really want to. And then we can nerd out, but usually they don't. And that was helpful to have more productive conversations. But even with launch, we started with the user-centered design workshop with, we had cabinet secretaries and legislators and, like Jason and Nate and our Google.org fellows and like our philanthropic partners there, all working together initially with just what's a vision? Like, who are our personas? Like, what are their barriers? What do they need to see? Like, and then we just set a goal for like 2 years from now. What do we want it to look like? And that's what we built. And then we went back and then figured out, okay, what are the data we need to do that? Does it exist? Do we need to collect it? And we just built from there. So I think using user-centered design, starting with the personas, starting with like, what does success look like for each of our populations, has been very powerful for us.
Yeah, Ken, I'm gonna commit an act of heresy.
Okay.
So I'm thinking about this, like, is it the data? Is it the story? How do we think about that? And it got me reflecting on some conversations I was having recently with some colleagues of mine who I've known for a very long time. So this is more me taking off the chamber hat, putting on the just workforce professional hat. And I think the paradigm that we've been operating under has been around evidence-based policymaking. And we started questioning, has that been more aspirational than reality? Like, is this a gut check moment to say, existentially, is this what we're actually doing? And I think a case could be made for and against that. And part of what I hope to bring to this convening is that, yes, that's important, but maybe we also need a new paradigm. And we need a new way of thinking about why we're collecting this data, how we're using it, who's benefiting from it, to create a larger scale value proposition. So what I would encourage this group to think about is that existential question of, do we need to move to a new paradigm, or is it doubling down on evidence-based policymaking?
Well, it's a great time to be thinking about these kinds of existential questions, because I feel like we're in an existential crisis, maybe. At least that was the hint that we got from the uncertainty conversation. A lot of things are being questioned. I actually did have a conversation with one of my federal counterparts who said stuff that wasn't on the table is now on the table. We can start talking about things in a different way than we could 6 months ago. And a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, and I think this is kind of that opportunity here. So can you sort of tell me your sort of perspectives about where you see sort of the big opportunities in this current environment that maybe we could see some change? Anybody want to take on that?
I see how Jason kind of was like, you guys over there.
Not me. I know. I saw that.
So I think Arkansas may have had a kind of a 2-year head start on kind of this transformative thinking, because when Governor Sanders opened our first Governor's Workforce Cabinet meeting, she started it with I don't want to hear this is how we've done things before. No more silos, all options on the table. Because we're 49th in a lot of things, we're 50th in food security, so like clearly just doing the same thing we've always done isn't going to work. And so she wants, like a radical rethinking of everything and just empowered us to go forward and make it happen. And so I think we have gaps now, and we have the opportunity to not just fill the gaps, but to like move beyond filling the gaps and getting back to where we were before, but like rethinking for the needs of today and tomorrow.
And I'm an optimist when it comes to this, and I think we could build something better. And I think now we need something national, but that doesn't necessarily mean federal. And we could do it in a public-private way. And I think we could solve some of these long-standing problems around not having a standardized means of defining data elements and UI and things like that. Like there's an opportunity to fundamentally modernize and transform what this data infrastructure looks like and who it serves. And it's going to be hard, it's going to take time, and it's going to take resources. But I think we can actually kind of create a new paradigm, and we could do it in a very different, more modern way. And I think JetX is an example of that. And in the current environment, I'm glad we've been working on this for as long as we have, because this could be like an exemplar use case for what new could look like and how employers could adopt new data and technology standards and APIs to standardize and transform how they share that data and who they share it with. So I think if we take that as just, here's a useful way of thinking differently and outside the box, and now apply it to all the other aspects of the data infrastructure that we need to preserve or modernize, I think it could be a very creative exercise where we might come out on the other end with something better than we had before, because we're not necessarily constrained by a lot of the legacies that came before us.
Well, and similarly, there's been a federal ban on student-level data within education since 2008. That hasn't changed. So while there is a lot of uncertainty around funding and surveys, administrative data is still generally generated by state actors, state data providers, institutions of higher ed, the districts themselves. And so, our investment strategy around data at Gates has always really been oriented towards those data providers, because that's where you go to get the value as a starting point, right? And so in this moment, we're going to continue to lean into that, and where we see the most opportunity here is hopefully to bring more states to the table, because as they seek out more reliable or trusted data sources, they're going to be looking around. And so Coleridge mentioning the PASS program and this demo tomorrow, I have no idea what it is, but I'm like, where are the other states? Because y'all got like 14 to 16 now. Like, the more that are here to be able to share, especially that workforce data for populations that are not adhering to whether they're in a specific state, learning and working in another, the more we could show that value of information doesn't just reside with the federal government and their aggregation approach, but actually still resides within localized communities, including districts as well, from my perspective.
Yeah, I get a sense that that this is an opportunity for us to fundamentally rethink some things, because in many states and many agencies, the answer no was acceptable, or yes was, you got no incentive for saying yes and lots of disincentive for saying no. And I think that maybe the disincentive level for no has dropped much more dramatically, and maybe there's some incentives for yes now. And I think that creates us a different sort of culture environment in potential collaborations that could happen. And from our perspective, in terms of organizations that we work with, the big issue has been that sort of notion of, when you didn't ask the question correctly, you got no immediately, and you couldn't get past that initial no. And I think we've got to spend some time with the user community, whether they're folks who are contributing to the information or actually are intermediaries supporting the businesses and individuals, the businesses and students or workers. That we've got to give some help to that network to make sure they're in a place where they can be of value to the community as well. So.
Okay. And Ken, I just want to curious, like in this room right now, show of hands, how many people are here in a capacity where they're representing the business community? 2. Imagine if next year, or a couple of years, there's a lot of hands going up, because now they're part of the conversation, they're relevant. So that's what I mean by this like paradigm shift, a different kind of approach, doing a more public-private way. And I think a testament to that is, the conversations the Chamber Foundation's been having with Ahu and Nathan at Coleridge and others about, well, where do we sit relative to Coleridge? And we understand that this is going to be, we understand how you're built, why you're built this way, and what you're doing. But imagine if we were directly sharing data in some capacity. What if we are successful with JetX and we can move data to Coleridge? Like, what would that look like? That's a very different kind of infrastructure now with different participants. So I think that's where there's kind of like room for optimism, is to say that could be that existential transformative moment to say, hey, this isn't just about, data that states collect and share and aggregate and solve problems with. What if all of you were doing that in a more public-private way, where business was a stakeholder at the table that shared in that value proposition? So those are the kinds of things I'm hoping folks can think about after today's event.
And hopefully some beneficiaries as well.
Right.
I mean, I think a lot of this work we're doing, when we set aside the compliance and accountability pieces at the state level, it's often in service of state success, right? State economic growth and opportunity. And that growth and opportunity is only as effective as the workers and the learners that are in that community. So I totally agree, Jason, that employers have a significant amount of data and information to bring to bear on the labor market. And if we're looking to increase return on investment and we're looking to increase the number of workers in particular states or in specific skills and trades, those voices, or at least a perspective on how they're using this information to make decisions, also needs to be part of the conversations that are ongoing here.
So I will mention we're involved with an effort with the Department of Defense focused on sort of their looking at their workforce for the future. As they evolve and we're developing new technologies, they're going to need a different kind of workplace and workforce. And we're doing a meeting this summer that has 4 tracks. One's focused on the solutions, one's focused on barriers, one's focused on partnerships, but we have a 4th one focused on data. And the interesting piece here is the notion of needing data as one of the key elements of trying to figure out who are going to be the workers of the future. Not only that, but how are we going to adapt the existing workers? Because let's not forget the existing workforce is still going to be a lot of our workforce and a lot of the driver of our economy. So as I was listening to Mark a little bit earlier, I was like, we gave him the challenge of looking into the future. So now I'm going to turn it back on you guys. What do you see this system looking like in the next year or a couple of years? And what are you doing to contribute to moving it in that direction? So can I pick on you, Robert, first? Because since you're in my line of eyesight.
Sure. And one thing I want to be very cognizant of is, I had to kind of bridge like 1,200 silos in the state. But I don't want to just build a bigger Arkansas-shaped silo. So that's why groups like this are so critical, and just standards like JetX and making sure that we're building for interoperability, because people move and data need to move with people. And we don't want to build 53 different versions of the same thing. That's just not efficient or effective. So I think, we're committed to doing everything in an interoperable way. Almost everything we do is open source. Then we're seeing some good successes with